Warren Buffett had always prided himself on his unassuming nature. Despite being one of the wealthiest men in the world, he often preferred to go unnoticed. That evening, as he walked into the exclusive Manhattan restaurant, he was doing just that, blending in with the crowd. His signature suit, though crisp and clean, was far from the flamboyant designer threads that filled the room. He wasn't wearing a flashy tie or making any dramatic gestures. It was just him, a quiet man looking for a peaceful dinner in a place that promised sophistication and quiet luxury. The maitre d' led him to a table in the corner, away from the more conspicuous patrons. For a moment, it almost felt as if no one had noticed who he was. As he settled into the plush chair, the restaurant's hum of conversation continued without pause. A couple near the window whispered excitedly about their upcoming vacation in Paris, while a man across the room loudly discussed his newest stock options. The clinking of fine china filled the space, and the smell of perfectly seared steaks wafted through the air. But Warren, as always, was content with his solitude. The night felt like just another meal, a brief respite from the whirlwind of meetings and billion-dollar decisions. He glanced at the menu, his thoughts drifting to his next big investment, when a tall, sharply dressed waiter appeared at his side. "Good evening, sir." The waiter greeted him with a smile that felt rehearsed, as if he were reading from a script he had memorized for years. "What can I get for you this evening?" Warren looked up, a slight smile tugging at his lips. "I'll have the filet mignon, medium rare, with a side of your finest mashed potatoes," he said, his voice calm and steady. The waiter scribbled it down, but before he could leave, he hesitated. His eyes briefly scanned Warren, then darted toward the table next to him, where a young couple Saturday, both in tailored designer outfits, their phones out as they snapped photos of each other, taking selfies for what seemed like an eternity. They hadn't noticed Warren at all. The waiter, though, had. For a split second, he looked flustered. Warren, completely unaware, was already lost in thought. "Is everything all right, sir?" Warren asked, breaking the silence. The waiter blinked, as if snapped from a trance, then nodded. "Oh, yes, of course. I'll place your order right away," he said, his voice slightly more strained than before. The waiter disappeared into the kitchen, and Warren returned to his menu, unaware of the subtle shift in atmosphere around him. It wasn't long before the maitre d', a tall, slim man with slicked-back hair and a smug smile, approached his table. The maitre d' glanced at Warren with a certain air of recognition before his eyes flicked briefly to the couple sitting nearby. Then, almost as if on cue, he leaned over and said, "Excuse me, sir. We've had a slight change of plans. I'm afraid you'll need to leave." Warren looked up in confusion. "Pardon me, sir. I must insist," the maitre d' said, his tone suddenly becoming firmer. "Our restaurant caters to a very specific clientele, and I'm afraid you don't quite meet the profile we usually serve." Warren blinked, his mind momentarily struggling to catch up. The maitre d' looked at him, his eyes darting quickly to the other tables in the room, as if seeking confirmation. His lips curled into a thin smile, one that wasn't so much polite as it was condescending. "I'm sorry. I don't think I understand. What do you mean?" Warren asked, his voice steady, though now tinged with a hint of amusement. The maitre d' leaned in a little closer, lowering his voice just enough for only Warren to hear. "It's a matter of appearances, sir," he said, barely able to mask his disdain. "We pride ourselves on maintaining an atmosphere of exclusivity. As I said, your style doesn't quite fit our usual standards. We have a reputation to uphold." At that, Warren's brows furrowed slightly. He was no stranger to people judging him based on his wealth, or rather, his lack of showy wealth, but this was something else entirely. "I see," Warren said, standing slowly, his voice calm but now more deliberate. "So, my suit isn't good enough for your establishment, is that it?" The maitre d' flinched, his smug expression faltering for a moment. "It's not about the suit, sir," he quickly added, floundering. "It's just that, well, we have a certain clientele. You understand?" Warren took a moment to process the absurdity of the situation. The man was essentially telling him that he wasn't dressed the right way to be in the restaurant, despite the fact that, in any other circumstance, people would have been thrilled to dine next to one of the wealthiest men on the planet. I understand, Warren said slowly, taking a deep breath. He stood and adjusted his suit jacket. But if you'll excuse me, I think I'd prefer to find a place where my appearance isn't such a problem. The maitre d' looked almost relieved, but Warren wasn't done yet. By the way, he said, turning back to the maitre d', I believe this will be my last visit. I don't tend to return to places that don't treat people with respect, no matter what they look like. The maitre d' swallowed hard, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for words. But Warren had already turned and was walking toward the door. The dining room had grown quiet. The hushed murmurs began to fill the space like a ripple through water. Some guests were staring at Warren. Some were whispering to each other, but none dared to say anything directly. As Warren reached for the door, he heard a voice from behind him. You know who that was, don't you? A woman at a nearby table whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear. Her husband, clearly confused, glanced over at Warren, who was now stepping out of the restaurant. Who? He asked. That was Warren Buffett, she gasped. The billionaire investor. A few other guests looked up at the name, their faces going from indifferent to shocked recognition. Warren was now in the lobby, but the ripple of surprise had reached a fever pitch. It seemed impossible that the man who had just walked out, the one who had been asked to leave, was the very same person who had transformed the stock market over the past few decades. The maitre d' watched helplessly as the last of the whispers trickled into the air. As if on cue, a staff member came rushing toward him. Sir, are you okay? The staff member asked, concern in his voice. The maitre d' was visibly shaken. That was Warren Buffett, he said, his voice shaky. Why did no one tell me? How did I not recognize him? Back at his office later that evening, Warren Buffett chuckled to himself as he read through the countless social media posts and news articles that had popped up about the incident. People were appalled. Of course, how could anyone, let alone a restaurant, treat Warren Buffett like this? But what amused him most was the sheer irony of the whole situation. He had spent his life building a legacy of integrity and humility, and now here he was, at the center of a bizarre public spectacle where the very thing that made him who he was, his modesty, had been the cause of his ejection. He couldn't help but laugh. Sometimes, life had a funny way of reminding you just how unpredictable it could be. In the days that followed, Warren received countless calls, texts, and messages from friends, colleagues, and even strangers. Most of them were furious on his behalf, while others were just plain baffled by the whole ordeal. But in the midst of all the chaos, one thing became clear. This was not going to be just another embarrassing incident. This was the start of something much bigger, something that would have a ripple effect far beyond the walls of that exclusive restaurant. And Warren had no idea yet just how much it was about to change everything. The evening had barely begun when Warren Buffett stepped out into the cool New York air. He wasn't angry, at least not in the traditional sense. There was a certain bemusement in his eyes, as if he had just witnessed the most absurd, yet somehow fitting, scene unfold before him. But there was no denying the oddity of it all. He, of all people, had been kicked out of a restaurant, a place that catered to the elite. As the maitre d' had put it, it almost felt like a strange kind of cosmic joke. Warren pulled his coat tighter around him, a wry smile playing at the corner of his lips. He had no intention of letting this go. He wasn't going to let the night slip by without making his feelings known, in his own peculiar way. So, instead of heading back to his hotel, Warren took out his phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. Charlie, he said, when his old friend and business partner Charlie Munger picked up. You wouldn't believe what just happened. Charlie's voice came through the phone, thick with amusement. Warren, I can't imagine anything that would surprise me at this point, but go ahead. I'm listening. Warren sighed, though it wasn't from frustration. I was just asked to leave a restaurant in Manhattan. Apparently, I don't meet the profile of their usual customers. He paused for a beat, as if trying to suppress a laugh. You know, I'm getting too old for this. What do you think, Charlie? Should I start dressing like one of those movie stars? There was a long pause on the other end before Charlie broke into laughter. Oh, Warren, only you could get kicked out of a restaurant and still make it sound like a joke. But seriously, what happened? Warren explained the situation in detail, recounting the absurd exchange with the maitre d' and how he'd been politely, but firmly, ushered out. When he finished, Charlie let out a whistle. Well, that's one way to get a free dinner, Charlie said. But I gotta admit, it's rich coming from a restaurant that prides itself on being exclusive, only to have a legendary investor walk in and get the boot. Maybe they think they're above the law, or, in your case, above basic common sense. Warren chuckled. I don't know if it's common sense they're lacking, but I'm thinking about showing them what happens when they don't respect the people who helped build the world they live in. Maybe it's time for a little lesson in humility. Charlie's tone shifted slightly. What are you thinking? Well, Warren began, pacing in the chilly air outside the restaurant. I think I'll pay them a visit tomorrow, show them who they're dealing with. But I'm not looking for a confrontation. Charlie, I'm just thinking it's time someone taught them how to treat people with dignity, no matter what they look like or how much money they have. Charlie's voice softened, as if considering the weight of Warren's words. If anyone can teach them that, it's you, Warren. But don't make it about revenge. Make it about showing the world how it should be done. People need that right now. Warren smiled, a knowing look crossing his face. Exactly. It's not about me. It's about what's right. I'll handle it. The next morning, after a long night of reflection, Warren dressed in the same modest suit he'd worn the night before and made his way back to the restaurant. This time, however, he wasn't going to let it slide. He was going to confront the manager, face to face, and make sure that this kind of treatment wasn't just forgotten. As he entered the restaurant, the familiar scent of fresh bread and sizzling steaks filled his nostrils once again. The maitre d' from the previous evening was standing by the door, but when he saw Warren approaching, his face paled. He turned to walk away, as if trying to avoid confrontation. But Warren wasn't about to let that happen. He stepped in front of the maitre d', blocking his path. Well, well, Warren said with a smile. Back at it again. Huh. The maitre d' stiffened, clearly uncomfortable. Mr. Buffett, I didn't expect you to come back. What can I do for you? Warren's eyes twinkled, his voice calm but firm. I think it's time we have a little chat. I'd like to speak to your manager. The maitre d' swallowed hard. He wasn't sure whether he should try to smooth things over or whether he should simply retreat into the kitchen. But before he could answer, the restaurant's manager emerged from the back, a tall man in his 40s, dressed in a crisp black suit that looked a little too polished. His smile was tight, and his eyes flicked nervously between Warren and the maitre d'. Mr. Buffett, I'm so sorry for the trouble last night, the manager said, his voice dripping with insincerity. I do hope you understand that our policies are meant to maintain a certain atmosphere here. We only serve guests who fit our vision of exclusivity. Warren raised an eyebrow. I'm not sure I understand, he said, his voice deliberately measured. What exactly is it about me that doesn't fit your vision? Is it my suit? My choice of shoes? Or maybe it's the fact that I've spent the last few decades building an empire. And yet, you seem to think I'm not worthy of a simple dinner? The manager shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for a way out. Mr. Buffett, it's not personal, I assure you. We just want to maintain a certain what? Warren interrupted, his voice now rising just enough to catch the attention of a few nearby diners. A certain elitism? A certain superiority complex? Or maybe it's just that you're too busy catering to a crowd who thinks they're better than everyone else. Because I'll tell you something, my friend, there's no exclusivity in that. And it certainly doesn't have anything to do with the quality of food or service. The manager seemed at a loss for words, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for a way to salvage the situation. But Warren wasn't done. He took a step closer, his eyes never leaving the manager's face. You see, Warren continued, his voice steady, I could buy this restaurant. Hell, I could buy every restaurant in this city, but I don't do that. I don't look down on people because of their appearance or their social status. I believe in respect, and I believe in treating people with dignity, no matter who they are or what they look like. What happened last night was nothing short of disrespectful, and I'm not going to let that slide." A nervous murmur spread through the restaurant. People were starting to pay attention now, some pulling out their phones, others whispering among themselves. The manager seemed to shrink under Warren's gaze, his bravado slipping away with each passing second. "I understand, Mr. Buffett," the manager said, his voice faltering. "I truly do. I I apologize for the misunderstanding." Warren shook his head, his smile returning, though it was more of a grimace now. "It's not about misunderstanding. It's about respect. You're not apologizing to me. You're apologizing to every single person who's ever been treated unfairly because of how they look. And I think you owe them all a bigger apology than just a few words." The manager looked like he wanted to say something, but he couldn't. Instead, he simply nodded, his face flushed with embarrassment. Warren turned away, taking a deep breath as he walked toward the door. But before he left, he paused and looked back. "I'll be back here tomorrow. I'll make sure this place gets the lesson it deserves. If you want to continue running your restaurant as a place of exclusion, that's your choice. But remember this, no matter how fancy your restaurant, no matter how many zeros are on your bill, treating people like they're less than human isn't acceptable. Not now. Not ever." With that, he walked out the door, leaving the manager standing there, a mix of anger, shame, and realization slowly creeping in. But Warren wasn't finished, not by a long shot. The next morning, the air around the restaurant buzzed with an unusual energy. News of Warren Buffett's confrontation had spread like wildfire. And before long, the story was all over social media. It wasn't just the business world that was paying attention anymore. The incident had caught the attention of ordinary people, too. Those who saw in Warren's words a reflection of their own frustrations. A battle against an exclusive world that seemed to favor the rich and powerful. At first, it seemed like a fleeting moment, a wealthy man, irritated by a pompous maitre d', making his point with eloquence and a touch of humor. But as the hours passed, the story began to take on a life of its own. Tweets flew out faster than Warren could have imagined, each one more exaggerated than the last. The hashtag Buffett versus exclusivity trended across the internet, with people offering their own takes on the event. Some in admiration of Warren's courage, others mocking the restaurant's elitism. The diner's management, however, was not amused. The phone calls started pouring in the moment the doors opened that day, with various media outlets wanting to get a statement. The manager, still reeling from the previous day's events, found himself in the midst of an escalating crisis. The restaurant, which had prided itself on its discerning clientele, was now under intense scrutiny for how it treated one of the most respected investors in the world. Meanwhile, at his office, Warren was sitting back in his chair, watching the waves of reaction spread across his phone screen. His assistant had briefed him on the situation, but Warren wasn't in the mood to rush out and make a statement just yet. Instead, he found a certain satisfaction in seeing the world reacting as it did. "It's funny," Warren muttered to himself, tapping the side of his phone thoughtfully. People were so eager to follow their so-called rules of exclusivity, but they never thought the rules would apply to them, too. He paused, then dialed Charlie's number. It rang a couple of times before his old friend picked up. "Warren." Charlie's voice crackled through the speaker. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest, haven't you?" Warren chuckled. "I suppose I have. It wasn't my intention, but it looks like the message is spreading." "Don't kid yourself, Warren. You knew exactly what you were doing," Charlie said with a knowing tone. "This whole thing is like a firestorm. The restaurant's probably regretting the day they ever thought they could pull that stunt." Warren smiled, the corners of his mouth lifting slightly. "They didn't count on the power of the people, Charlie. They thought they could just throw me out and get away with it. But now, they're facing something far bigger than a billionaire's bad mood." Charlie let out a laugh, though it was laced with a hint of caution. "Yeah, well, just don't get too carried away. You've made your point. The world's watching now. But don't turn this into something personal." "I'm not," Warren replied, his tone turning serious. This is about something bigger. It's about changing the way people think about exclusivity, about breaking down these walls people put up around themselves. I'm not doing it for me. I'm doing it for everyone who's ever been made to feel less than simply because they don't fit the mold. Charlie paused for a moment before speaking again. You always know how to make things sound so simple, Warren. Just don't forget that sometimes the ripples you create can turn into waves. Warren leaned back in his chair, contemplating the gravity of Charlie's words. He had created a stir. Yes, but it was only the beginning. He had made a stand, but now he had to decide what to do next. He wasn't going to back down. But what was the next step? How would he ensure that this confrontation, this moment of tension, didn't just fade into a viral story? Across town, the manager of the restaurant was pacing back and forth in his office. The calls kept coming in, each one more insistent than the last. Some wanted interviews. Others wanted statements. His inbox was filled with emails from people who claimed to be outraged by Warren's treatment. But there were also those who were trying to spin the story to their advantage, suggesting that this was a publicity stunt or a misunderstanding. But the one thing that stood out to the manager was the number of restaurant regulars who had canceled their reservations. It wasn't just that they were worried about the PR fallout. They were worried that dining at the restaurant now, after the incident, would be seen as a tacit endorsement of the establishment's behavior. That was the kind of thing that could destroy a business. As the manager sat there, wringing his hands, he received a call from the owner of the restaurant, a well-known celebrity chef who had built his brand on the concept of elite dining. Rick. The owner's voice boomed through the phone. What the hell is going on? I've been getting calls from every media outlet in the country. I'm getting interviewed by people who think we're some kind of country club for the rich and famous. I don't know what happened. Mark. Rick said, his voice laced with frustration. We didn't do anything wrong. We followed the rules. We asked him to leave because he didn't fit our profile. It wasn't personal. Mark was silent for a moment. Rick, do you know who Warren Buffett is? He's not just some profile. He's a legend in the business world. People look up to him. And now, the world's looking at us like we're the villains. Rick's throat tightened. What do you want me to do about it? You think we can just invite him back? Of course not. Mark snapped. But you need to fix this. Fast. You need to issue a public apology. A sincere one. And then you need to make some serious changes to how you run this place. We can't afford to be known as the restaurant that kicked out one of the richest men in the world just because he wasn't wearing the right kind of suit. I'll get on it, Rick said, though the panic was clear in his voice. The next few hours were a whirlwind. The restaurant released an official statement, apologizing profusely for what they had called a regrettable misunderstanding. But it wasn't enough to calm the tide of anger from the public. The damage had already been done. But what they didn't anticipate was the shift that was beginning to take place in the media and among their customers. Warren, ever the strategist, watched it all unfold with a mixture of amusement and contemplation. He could see the world shifting, the way people were beginning to question these old systems of exclusivity, the invisible walls that divided society into haves and have-nots. But more than that, he could see how this moment had become more than just an incident. It had become a movement. People weren't just talking about a restaurant. They were talking about fairness, dignity, and respect. It wasn't long before other figures in the business world started weighing in. CEOs, entrepreneurs, and even influencers who had once embraced the world of exclusivity were now speaking out, voicing support for Warren's stance. His simple act of standing up had struck a chord with many people. The ripple effect had begun, and it was growing. Warren sat back in his chair, reflecting on how quickly things had escalated. He'd been right to call the restaurant out, but now he had to ensure that this was more than just a story that would fade. He had to make sure it led to something real. I think it's time for a little more than just words, Warren muttered to himself. Before picking up the phone once more, he dialed Charlie again, his mind already racing ahead. Charlie, it's time to get the ball rolling, he said when his friend picked up. I've been thinking about what comes next. I'm going to put my money where my mouth is. Charlie's voice came through with a slight chuckle. What are you planning now, Warren? Warren's grin widened. I'm thinking it's time to open a place that's not just for the elite. A place where anyone, no matter who they are, can come in, be treated with respect, and enjoy a meal without being judged. Charlie paused for a second, then laughed. Warren, you're a genius. You just might have the world eating out of your hands. Warren didn't respond with his usual modesty. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, letting the plan settle in his mind. I think it's time, he said, to change the way the world eats. It had been a few days since Warren's confrontation at the restaurant, and the public's reaction had only intensified. The buzz around the incident was still roaring across social media, news outlets, and even podcasts. What had started as a simple dispute between a billionaire and an exclusive restaurant had transformed into a movement, one that was redefining what it meant to be elite and forcing people to question the very concept of exclusion in society. Warren had kept a low profile, allowing the media to carry the story, but his mind was already far ahead. He was thinking about the next move, about how he could not only capitalize on this moment, but also push forward with his broader vision. A restaurant that would embody fairness and inclusivity. He wanted to show the world that greatness wasn't about exclusivity. It was about respect and humanity. But just as the conversation began to solidify around Warren's vision of fairness, a shocking twist occurred, one that no one could have predicted. It all started on a Thursday morning, when Warren's phone buzzed with a notification. A familiar name appeared on his screen: Rick, the manager of the restaurant that had kicked him out. Rick had been the first to feel the pressure of the public outcry. The weight of running a high-profile restaurant was nothing compared to the storm he now found himself in. He was trying to save face, and after days of futile crisis management, he finally realized he had no choice but to reach out to Warren directly. Warren picked up the phone, half expecting another apology. "Rick," he said, his voice calm, "I'm surprised to hear from you. What can I do for you today?" Rick's voice was strained, an edge of desperation in his words. "Mr. Buffett, I'm sorry. I know I don't deserve another chance, but I need to talk to you. It's about the restaurant. We've made a huge mistake, and I think I can make things right." Warren leaned back in his chair, intrigued. "Go on." Rick hesitated, then spoke quickly, the words tumbling out as if he couldn't stop himself. "I've been getting calls, Mr. Buffett, not just from the media, but from people in the industry. High-profile customers are canceling reservations. Some are even threatening to boycott the restaurant. The pressure is mounting, and I don't know how to fix this. I've spoken to Mark, and we both agree that if we want to salvage our reputation, we need to make things right. That means offering you a very generous apology." Warren could hear the panic in Rick's voice, the realization that his world was collapsing. But Warren wasn't ready to let him off the hook that easily. "And what exactly do you think an apology is going to do?" he asked, his voice measured, probing. "You can't just apologize your way out of this. Rick, you've already shown your true colors. You don't respect people unless they fit your ideal. Do you think that's something I can just forget?" Rick took a deep breath, then lowered his voice. "Mr. Buffett, I know I've messed up, but here's the thing. We want to turn this around. Mark's idea is to make a bold move, to do something unexpected that will get the attention of the public, and he wants you to be a part of it. We want to invite you to come back to the restaurant, not just as a guest, but as a partner. We're offering you a stake in the restaurant. You'd have a say in the way it's run. We want to change things, and we think you could help us." Warren's eyebrows rose. This was unexpected. A stake in the restaurant? After everything that had happened? Was this a desperate plea, or was there something more to it? "You want me to help you save your business," Warren said, his voice a mix of curiosity and skepticism. "But you think I'm the right person for that? After the way you treated me? After what I've said publicly? You're asking me to come in, to help turn this place around? Why would I do that?" Rick was silent for a moment before responding. "Because this is bigger than just you and me. It's about the message we send. The world is watching. Mr. Buffett, if you come in, if you partner with us, we can show everyone that even the most exclusive places can change. We can make it about fairness, inclusivity. You've already sparked a movement, and we want you to lead it." Warren's mind was racing. He could see the potential in what Rick was saying. He wasn't sure about the sincerity of the restaurant's intentions, but the opportunity to shift the narrative was too compelling to ignore. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about redemption. It was about something much bigger, about changing the way people thought about access, privilege, and power. "I'll think about it," Warren said, finally, "but I'll need time. This isn't a decision I make lightly." As he hung up the phone, Warren felt a strange sense of déjà vu. It was as though the universe was once again testing him, pushing him to decide what kind of impact he wanted to have. This wasn't about money. It wasn't about prestige. It was about using his platform to show the world that real power lay in inclusivity, not exclusion. The next few days were filled with a mixture of reflection and intrigue. Warren knew that if he accepted Rick's offer, he'd be diving into a world he had always stayed away from, the world of luxury restaurants and the high-powered elite. But maybe that was exactly what the world needed. A little disruption in a place where people assumed nothing would ever change. He sat down with Charlie to discuss the proposal. Charlie, ever the pragmatist, listened carefully before offering his thoughts. "You're not going to solve anything by buying into this," Charlie said, his voice skeptical. "You've already made your point. You don't need to get involved with these people any more than you already have. They're not the ones who need to change. It's the system." Warren shook his head. "It's not just about the system, Charlie. It's about what I can do with this platform. If I accept their offer, I'll have the chance to change how the industry works from the inside. People look at me differently because of what I've built. I can use that to break down these barriers. But if I walk away, if I just dismiss them, then what happens? This becomes just another story that fades into the background." Charlie sighed. "I get it. But just remember, Warren, people can see through things. If they think you're just in it for the money or the prestige, it won't work." Warren smiled, a spark of determination in his eyes. "Don't worry, Charlie. I'm not doing this for the money. I'm doing it because I want to change the way people think. The world needs to know that success isn't about what you own. It's about how you treat others. And maybe, just maybe, I can use this platform to show that." Charlie studied him for a moment, then nodded. "You're always 2 steps ahead of everyone else, Warren. I don't know how you do it." "I don't know either," Warren said with a grin, "but I'm about to find out." And so, after much contemplation, Warren made his decision. He would accept the offer from the restaurant, but with conditions. He would take the stake, but only if they committed to true reform, not just in their business practices, but in the way they viewed their customers. He would work with them, but on his terms. If they were going to change, it had to be real. Warren's decision sent shockwaves through the media. The story of a billionaire teaming up with a high-profile, exclusive restaurant that had once kicked him out seemed too surreal to believe. But Warren wasn't looking for drama. He wasn't looking to be a headline. He was looking for a way to make a lasting impact, a way to change the very fabric of how people interacted with the world of the ultra-wealthy. What followed was nothing short of a spectacle. Warren's first public appearance at the restaurant, after officially becoming a partner, was a highly anticipated event. The cameras were flashing, reporters lined the streets, and people waited with bated breath to see what the man who had taken on the elite would do next. Warren, dressed in his usual modest attire, walked through the doors of the restaurant with the same calm demeanor he had when he had first entered. But this time, there was a sense of purpose in his step. He wasn't just there to be a figurehead. He was there to lead. Inside, the scene was electric. The staff had undergone extensive training on how to treat every guest equally, regardless of their status. They had reworked their menu to include affordable options, and the entire atmosphere of the restaurant had shifted. No longer was it a place that only catered to the ultra-rich. Now, it was a place for everyone, a place where respect, dignity, and inclusivity took center stage. Warren took a moment to speak to the gathered crowd of reporters. "This is more than just about one restaurant," he said, his voice firm and clear. "It's about creating a world where success isn't defined by what you own or how much you have. It's defined by how you treat people. This restaurant is just the beginning. We're going to show the world that true greatness lies in respect, not in exclusivity. The cameras flashed, and for the first time in weeks, Warren felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. But it wasn't a burden. It was a responsibility he was ready to embrace. And with that, the ripple effect he had started would go even further. What had begun as a simple act of defiance against a single restaurant was now a full-blown revolution, one that would change the course of history. The days that followed Warren's public appearance at the restaurant were a whirlwind of media coverage, interviews, and public curiosity. What had once been a simple clash between a billionaire and an exclusive restaurant had now become the story of the year. Everywhere Warren went, people spoke of the restaurant's transformation, of how it had shifted from an elitist den to a symbol of inclusivity and equality. It wasn't just the rich who were talking about it anymore. The regular person, someone who had never set foot inside a fine dining restaurant, was now tuned into this radical change. They were waiting for someone to lead, and Warren had given them that leader. The restaurant, now rebranded under a new name that embodied its mission, the common table, had become an instant success. Lines stretched out the door every evening, not just because of the food, but because of the message. People wanted to be a part of something bigger than themselves, something that said, "You belong here." Warren had turned what could have been a simple act of rebellion into a symbol of hope for the marginalized, the overlooked, and the underrepresented. It wasn't just about food anymore. It was about a movement, and Warren had become its unlikely leader. But just as things began to settle into what seemed like a comfortable rhythm, life threw another unexpected challenge Warren's way. It was a quiet Sunday morning when his assistant, a sharp and efficient woman named Emily, came into his office with a concerned look on her face. "Mr. Buffett," she said, walking briskly over to his desk, "there's something you need to see." She handed him a printout of an article that had just been published. Warren glanced at the headline, his stomach dropping. Billionaire's Restaurant, a new way or just a trend? Warren scanned the article, which was penned by a prominent food critic who had been following the common table since its reopening. The critic was skeptical of the restaurant's success, suggesting that it was merely a flash in the pan, an attempt to cash in on the current trend of social justice and inclusivity. He questioned whether it could sustain itself, citing the complexities of balancing fine dining with accessibility. Warren folded the paper slowly, his thoughts swirling. "It was bound to happen," he muttered, more to himself than to Emily. Emily took a seat across from him. "Are you going to respond to this?" Warren leaned back in his chair, staring out the window. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing on him. The article wasn't wrong in some ways. The restaurant had achieved an immediate success, but long-term sustainability was another issue entirely. Could they keep up the momentum? Could they maintain the delicate balance of high-quality food and inclusivity? His mind drifted back to his conversation with Charlie, the one where his old friend had warned him about the very challenge he was now facing. "Don't get too carried away, Warren. You're not going to change the world overnight." The problem wasn't just the critic's article. The problem was the expectations he had set for himself and for the common table. He had raised the bar not just for the restaurant, but for what he believed society could become, a place where success and opportunity were open to everyone, not just the privileged few. He had made a promise to himself, and now, it felt like the entire world was waiting to see if he could actually deliver. "I think I need to do something," Warren said, his voice firm. "Something that will prove this isn't just a trend. I'm going to invite the world to see it for themselves." Emily looked confused. "What do you mean?" Warren smiled, a glint of mischief in his eyes. "I'm going to host an event, a dinner, but not just any dinner. I'm going to invite the critics, the influencers, the businessmen, and the regular people. I'm going to make them sit down together, at the same table. I'll invite the homeless man on the street corner, and I'll invite the CEO of the biggest tech company in the world. They'll all sit together, and they'll see, up close, that equality doesn't just belong in the speeches and the slogans. It belongs at the table." The idea felt right. It wasn't just a publicity stunt. It was a statement. And it was exactly the kind of bold move Warren needed to push back against the critics who had already begun to question the restaurant's longevity. The plans for the dinner came together quickly. The event, which Warren dubbed the Great Equalizer, would be held at the common table, and it would be a night unlike anything anyone had ever seen before. The venue would be packed with an eclectic mix of people from all walks of life. There would be no VIP sections, no fancy dress codes, no lines separating the rich from the poor. Everyone would eat the same meal, drink the same wine, and share the same experience. For one night, the restaurant would be a true equalizer. Word about the event spread quickly, and soon, the world was watching. Media outlets covered every detail, the guest list, the menu, the concept. But the most intriguing question of all was whether Warren's bold move would work. Would people actually come together? Would they eat side by side, without judging each other? Or would it all fall apart? The night of the event arrived, and Warren stood at the entrance of the restaurant, waiting for the guests to arrive. He was dressed in his usual attire, a simple suit, a light blue shirt, and his ever-present smile. He had done everything in his power to make the night as inclusive as possible, ensuring that all types of people would be represented. There were people from all walks of life, business moguls, tech giants, teachers, laborers, social activists, and even people who had been homeless just a few months ago. Warren wanted them all to feel like equals tonight, and he was determined to make it happen. As the guests began to filter into the restaurant, Warren couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. This was bigger than just food. This was bigger than the restaurant. This was about showing the world that it was possible to live in a world where no one was left out, where the barriers between classes didn't exist. The evening kicked off with speeches from a few influential figures, but Warren had made it clear from the start that this wasn't going to be about long, drawn-out speeches or platitudes. This was about the experience of sitting at the same table as someone you'd never imagined sharing a meal with, the experience of breaking bread with someone whose life had been completely different from your own. Warren took the stage briefly, standing up at the podium. "Tonight," he said, his voice resonating throughout the room, "is about more than just food. It's about reminding ourselves that no matter who we are, we all deserve a seat at the table. And tonight, we're proving that equality is not just a dream. It's a reality. Enjoy the meal, and let's make this a night to remember." The room erupted in applause. But the real magic happened as the evening unfolded. People who had never interacted with each other before began to talk. The homeless man seated next to a tech entrepreneur laughed at his jokes. A schoolteacher chatted with a millionaire about the challenges of education reform. A chef from the local food scene swapped stories with a CEO about the best dishes from around the world. The dinner was a success, not because of the food, but because of the connection that was made between people who had never considered sitting together before. By the end of the night, it was clear that Warren's vision had come to life. The critics, who had originally doubted the common table's longevity, were now writing glowing reviews. They had seen with their own eyes the power of inclusivity. They had witnessed the magic that happens when people set aside their differences and come together. But for Warren, the success of the night wasn't in the applause or the praise. It was in the moments he saw between the guests, the smiles, the laughter, the understanding that had passed between people who had once seen each other as strangers. It was in the realization that this wasn't just a restaurant. This was a movement. As the night drew to a close, Warren stood outside, watching as the last of the guests left the restaurant. He had done it. He had proven that change was possible. And it wasn't just about a single event or a viral story. It was about a new way of thinking, a new legacy that he was leaving behind. The world had shifted, just a little bit, and as Warren watched the lights of the city flicker in the distance, he knew that his mission was far from over. The ripple effect had begun, and he was ready to see where it would go next. But for now, Warren allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. He had done what no one thought possible. He had shown the world that the true measure of success was not in the things you owned, but in the way you treated others. And that, he knew, was a legacy that would endure long after the last plate had been cleared from the common table. The real work was only just beginning. As Warren's journey unfolded in the restaurant, one thing became clear: success is not measured by what you own, but by how you treat others. The real legacy lies in the relationships we build, the inclusivity we foster, and the empathy we show to those around us. In a world where privilege and exclusion often dominate, it's essential to remember that true greatness comes from creating spaces where everyone has a seat at the table, regardless of their background, status, or wealth. The story of the common table is more than just about a restaurant. It's about breaking down barriers and challenging societal norms. It's about asking yourself, how can I contribute to a world that values fairness and inclusivity? How can I change the way people interact with each other? Not based on what they have, but based on who they are? Warren's bold move wasn't just about changing a restaurant. It was about changing the way we think about power, opportunity, and respect. In the end, what we do for others, how we lift them up, and how we treat everyone with dignity, those are the things that define our true legacy. So, what can we learn from Warren's story? True success is about inclusivity, not exclusivity. The more you can make room for others, the more you grow. Don't be afraid to challenge the status quo. Sometimes, it takes a bold move to make real change. Every single person deserves respect, whether they are a CEO or a homeless person. Everyone has value. If you found this story inspiring, make sure to hit the subscribe button for more stories that challenge the way we see the world and inspire us to make a difference. And don't forget to leave your thoughts in the comments below. What would you do if you had the chance to make a big change like Warren? Let's start a conversation. Together, we can create a world where everyone truly belongs. Let's spread the message.